Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Hey, good evening, everybody. Haha, it's nighttime. All right, it's April Fool's Day. Good morning, everybody. Monday, April 1st, 2019, April Fool's Day. Time to be on the lookout for, I guess, actual fake news stories. Today's like the day for it, and everybody thinks it's hilarious. Everybody thinks fake everything is hilarious today. I'm not really sure what to make of all of this. We'll sort through the stories and try to distinguish between what's real and what's merely ridiculous, plus what's fake on top of all of that. There's a little bit of everything. A smorgasbord out there for us to discover today, minus a lot of pickled fish, I hope. Doesn't sound like a great thing for me. All right, we're ready to roll. It's a new day. It's a new week. It's a new month. And, I don't know. So the course of history not yet exactly changed. I feel like the weekend didn't move the needle much one way or the other. Everything sort of froze in place. And it occurs to me that might have been White House strategy heading into the weekend. But I think that they thought they were going to be freezing in place the narrative that they introduced during the past week on the Mueller report having been released and showing no collusion and exonerating the president, none of which is actually true, including the part about the Mueller report being released. Of course, you know this. And they ran the program anyway, and it just froze in place. The early indications in the polls that nobody was believing the White House spin. Maybe a little early to reach that conclusion, and I guess now there's been enough time, and I suppose this week we'll begin to see results. I don't know whether they're going to confirm what we found early, but the last couple of polls, I guess, that we discussed during the week certainly, I guess, had been conducted post submission of the report to Bob Barr, who later on, of course, ended up releasing the only, I guess, official version of events as the White House claims were summarized from the Mueller report, or I guess, as I called it, without taking note of it in particular at the time until I got a note about it over the weekend, of Bob Barr's 4 pages of fan fiction about the Mueller report. Of course, he wouldn't be strictly speaking a fan of the Mueller report, but I guess if you can rewrite it any way you want and cherry pick only the results you like, I suppose you could be a fan of anything. Big breaking news of sorts this morning. Lots of journalist chatter about a move by the House Judiciary Committee to authorize subpoenas for the entire Mueller report and several witnesses. As a matter of fact, it sits atop the Daily Coast front page right now, Jen Hayden having put the story together. And hey, guess what? It says pretty much the same thing. House Democrats will authorize subpoenas for the Mueller report and key witnesses on Wednesday. So among the key witnesses is Hope Hicks. So I gather that the committee is interested in finding out once and for all how she was able to do it all of that time. I never really have had I think, a decent accounting from, I don't know who I would demand it of, from journalists in general about what was behind their strange fascination with Hope Hicks. And for a time, she seemed to be the only, or she was being portrayed as the only competent person inside the Trump campaign. And I don't know, I wouldn't say it really persisted into the Trump administration, though they certainly had a more favorable view of Hope Hicks during her time in the administration than they did of almost anyone else. But the magic did seem to have rubbed off at that point. But I just never really came to understand why they were so enamored of Hope Hicks's competency in the early days of the Trump campaign. And I think it just came down to the rest of the campaign was so incompetent that anyone who actually would say things like, if not actually do things like, who would say things like, I will answer your email. I will follow up and get an answer for you. I don't know the answer, and I'm not going to get it from anyone who does, but I am going to get you something. And that, I guess, passed as competency, and everyone became enamored of her amazing abilities. Well, we'll see what she has to say come subpoena time, except, of course, that, well, underlying all of what we do here is the deep and penetrating cynicism about the subpoena process. But we'll let it play out, and that's the portion of the story that we'll see discussed today and this week and up through probably the end of the week. And it probably won't be for another week to 2 weeks before the narrative, if it gets to this point, moves on to, hey, these subpoenas aren't the sort of thing we always thought they were from television police dramas. But we're about a week away from that, and now we get to enjoy the stories about the heavy hand bringing down the hammer on Trump Russia. And we'll see how far that goes. And who knows? Maybe if that narrative takes hold, I suppose any number of, false or thin narratives have driven the discussion before. Maybe that one will take hold and everyone will just come to believe that something amazing has happened and it's time to, I don't know, put Trump in jail. I guess anything can happen, just like anything can happen in, let's say, national basketball tournaments. Anyway, Greg Dworkin is here to discuss all of these things that can happen and what happened over the weekend.
Except for national basketball tournaments.
Yeah, well, you don't have to discuss that one.
Good.
Everyone has that covered, I think.
Well, UConn women made the Final Four for the 12th time in a row.
They make too many finals. That's the problem with them. America has UConn women fatigue. Oh? Yeah.
Which is something you can't say on the
12
the male
times
side.
they've all graduated. That is something. I would look into that if I were you.
Yeah. Well, that's the nice thing about women's basketball. Most of the kids graduate, so it's great.
Yeah,
but,
well, they're actually
let's
in college.
Let's talk about stuff. We'll do some Mueller stuff. We'll do some lightning rounds here. This is from Brian Beutler points out the Washington Post had a very nice correction. The correction reads, a previous version of this story said that Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report did not, according to Attorney General William Barr's summary, find evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. Barr's memo simply said Mueller had not established a criminal conspiracy. So the Washington Post is walking back the Trump exonerated thing. The New York Times has to walk back their cloud is lifted because the public says a cloud really hasn't been lifted. In fact, public opinion on that is pretty clear. Before we get to that, though, this is a nice New York Times op-ed by Jerry Nadler saying the entire reason for appointing the special counsel was to protect the investigation from political influence. By offering us his version of events in lieu of the report, the Attorney General, a recent political appointee, undermines the work and integrity of his department.
Yes.
He also denies the public the transparency it deserves. We require the full report, the special counsel's words, not the Attorney General's summary or a redacted version. So that's Nadler's pitch in terms of subpoenaing the report. And of course, this isn't what happens in real life, but I have these visions of a 4:30 a.m. raid with SWAT teams and stuff, making sure that report gets there.
I would enjoy it, but no.
Roger Cohen style.
Yeah, well, it pays to look. You keep hope alive this way with daydreams. But yeah, we'll see. It'll be very interesting, and a lot of people will learn about the subpoena process for the first time, and then it'll be elections.
It'll be interesting because not all subpoenas have equal weight, but the Judiciary Committee has a pretty good case for making the point that they actually have constitutional oversight and really need to see that report, if not other people.
Well, yeah, we should pat them on the head.
Different than the public.
Yep. Okay. Well, you guys have that right. You go and get it.
Yeah, well, they may. Mm-hmm. So other things, lightning round style. There were legislative special elections in Louisiana.
Yeah.
And Louisiana GOP was soundly rejected by voters. Sure. Democrats had a seat that Trump won by 18 points. They held that seat. And the GOP lost a seat that Trump had won by 17 points. And a reminder that in Louisiana, I guess like Virginia, the state legislature and governor is on the ballot this fall.
Ah, all right. Good.
And that, in other words, they do, on odd year elections.
Yes, like Virginia. I mean,
At least
I don't
at least
find
this
it
year
that
they
odd.
do. I don't know. So
Yeah, I don't
and they
remember that
had
being the
what
case.
was interesting is they had the
Yes, I
closing
do.
mailer
Yeah.
from the LA GOP in Louisiana House District 18. Trump won the district big in 2016. The GOP candidate lost there 69-31. And if you look at the mailer, it's paid for by friends of Tammy Fabre, New Roads, Louisiana. A big Trump thumbs up, double thumbs up, no collusion with Robert Mueller pensively looking added to the picture by Photoshop next to Trump. And it says, Tammy Fabre, Trump totally exonerated. She lost.
That's a fabrication.
Well, you know, the idea that, oh, this is great, a third of the country, like, really believes that what's going on here is great, you know, it just puts in perspective that in the real world, it's not working out the way that the Trump White House intended. More lightning round here.
Sure.
Susan Collins has sent a letter to Attorney General Barr urging him to reconsider Department of Justice's decision to strike down the Affordable Care Act. The administration should not attempt to use the courts to bypass Congress. So this is a sternly worded letter from a very serious person, and I just thought that the public should know.
All right. Did you mail it?
I don't know. Maybe she hand delivered it. Maybe she had the marshal of the Supreme Court bring it over.
I am just curious. Sometimes they hold those things.
Why, you think it hasn't gotten there yet?
I think
It could
sometimes
take weeks
they do
if
think.
she used the mail system.
Yes, that's true. I have run into the situation in the past. Like I have, I have written a sternly worded letter to the Attorney General, and then they say, well, did you get it? Send it? That's a very specific question. I don't have information on that. I'll get back to you.
Did they receive it? Is even more the
Yeah, I mean, that's eventually that becomes more the point. But yeah, occasionally I have seen people have press conferences about having drafted these letters, and then they're asked point blank if they sent them. And
All right. So here's the next lightning round, maybe the last one.
Okay.
The Democratic plan for health care includes strengthening the Affordable Care Act. That's ACA 2.0 that Nancy Pelosi is proposing, and then sorting out 9 different plans to make the system better.
9.
Ranging from Medicare for All, Medicare for America, a buy-in, all sorts of different plans that are on the table right now. Whereas Trump has a plan.
Yeah.
He does. He's appointing Rick Scott, the executive overseeing a $1.5 billion Medicare scam, as his point person to convince you you're not getting ripped off.
Is he not busy elsewhere?
Oh, well, ripping off the public and doing Medicare scams is Rick Scott's expertise and superpower. Yes, I know he was elected in Florida for that, but, that's Florida. So that is his plan. There's a nice story from the Orlando Sentinel. Rick Scott becomes Trump point man on GOP healthcare policy.
Point head, man. Pointy head.
Because, look, somebody has to take the flop. Trump isn't going to do it when it fails.
Well, he won't get back up again. So, yeah. Right. All right. So, okay, Rick Scott. Yeah. Awesome. No problem there.
Right. Exactly. So, there is a problem. And again, it's a question of what the public thinks. So, new polling over the weekend, this one from NBC News. Most Americans don't think Trump is in the clear yet on Russia, new poll finds. President Trump's approval remains stable, was 46 in February, now it's 43. It was 43 in December, it was 43 in January. You may see a pattern here. President Trump's approval remains stable, and a third of voters say they don't know whether the summary of Mueller's findings clears him of wrongdoing.
Okay.
Right? In other words, the public is
fair.
totally willing to, why don't we wait and see what the Mueller report actually says?
Yes, right. I mean, I'm just a little bit stunned that people are giving the right answer.
Right. According to a new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, 29% of Americans say they believe Trump has been cleared, 40% say they don't believe he's been cleared, and 31% wait and see. They're not sure.
Okay.
That's nearly half of independents and a quarter of both Democrats and Republicans. Now, remember, if this was such a great report, it would have been out already.
True. Yeah.
Right? Well, Jeff Horwath, the Democratic firm Hart Research, which conducted the poll along with Republican pollster Bill McInturf, the usual Wall Street Journal NBC duo, The public is still in a wait-and-see view of this investigation and what it means for Trump. Much of that ambiguity may be because less than half the public says they've been deeply engaged, while a large majority of Americans, 78%, say they've heard about the Mueller report. Only 39% say they've heard a lot about the story. And that's a smaller share of the population than those who said they heard a lot about other stories, like the decision to fire James Comey or the release of the Access Hollywood tape. That generally has about 50 to 60% penetration. Astounding that it's not 100%, which is a reminder that for the most part, the American public doesn't pay attention. And that's why I think the actual Mueller report will have much bigger impact than people think. Well, we know all of this stuff. No, actually, the public doesn't know all of this stuff.
Well, there'll be a lot more opportunity to generate more exciting headlines with much more material to mine when it comes out. So that's not a bad guess. That's how Americans tend to digest their public information.
Right. Meanwhile, the Washington Post has their own poll. 32% say Trump has been exonerated on obstruction, but public is evenly split on whether Trump committed wrongdoing in regard to Russian interference. But here are some specific numbers. Should the Mueller final report be made public in its entirety? 83% say yes. Don't forget, a lot of Republicans are now convinced that it exonerates Trump, so there's pressure to release it to prove their point. We have to agree with them and find common ground on this.
We'll work on it.
Sure, you're probably right at exonerate. Yeah, go ahead. Release it. All of it.
Well, or should we do that, or should we be like, no, don't do it? I'm so afraid as a Democratic partisan.
So far, do you think Barr has released enough details? 28% say yes. 57% say no.
Yes.
Aside from Mueller's conclusion on criminal conspiracy, how concerned, if at all, are you about the amount of contact between Trump's associates and Russians during the 2016 presidential campaign? Net concerned 57%, net not concerned 41%. So most people, and 57% qualifies as most people. Most people don't think that what the Trump administration campaign, that is at that point, did is very good. Now, what about you? Mueller didn't conclude, but what about you? Do you think Trump obstructed justice or not? 49 say yes, 44 say no. That's pretty good in the absence of seeing what Mueller lays out.
Yeah, okay. People are, we're not supposed to be happy about people being predisposed to one conclusion or another, but that's the one you should be predisposed to.
Right. So political scientist Jonathan Bernstein sums up, Mueller may have cleared Trump. We don't know that. He may have. Maybe he didn't. But the voters don't care. The good news on the president's biggest scandal, and Trump was saying it's good news for him, hasn't improved his ratings. As the politics goes, this is news that's all bad for Trump. A week after Barr's summary, and after some pretty successful spin from the Trump team that produced a lot of favorable coverage, there's been no reaction at all from the electorate. So if they were trying to game the system prior to the actual release so that when it came out, people wouldn't pay attention or wouldn't believe it, that's a fail. If they wanted to get some good headlines in the first few days, that succeeded, but it didn't succeed in changing public opinion.
All right.
On March 22nd, the day Mueller's report, this is Jonathan Bernstein, was delivered, 538 estimated that Trump's approval was 41.9. By March 31st, he'd inch up to 42.1.
Yes.
And 52.9 disapproval did not change one bit. Not a whit. Not one iota. Not a smidgen. It's possible that the mix of polls of random fluctuations are masking small improvement. It's also possible the news has been slow to reach those who pay less attention. But those theories are increasingly difficult to buy as the days go on and the story fades. Nor are polls about the investigation showing any radical shift towards Trump. So it seems likely Mueller's report isn't changing many minds, with a reminder it's not really the Mueller report. Here's why that's bad news for Trump. His approval rating is the second worst of any president on record after 801 days in office, which is where Trump was on Sunday. Only Ronald Reagan was worse. Trump is dead last in disapproval rating. No other president was over 50%. He's also last in net approval at -10, with unusually steady numbers. This is no fluke. Things could change. Reagan's numbers dipped, and then he started a comeback, so Trump, in theory, could recover, yada, 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 yada. But the truth is, we don't know why Trump is so unpopular, especially, we do.
Well, yes.
Especially at a moment of relative peace and prosperity for the U.S. It could be the various scandals. It could be his refusal to behave like a normal president, normal person, I would add. It could be his divisive campaign permanently alienated a lot of people. Yes, bingo, that one. It could also be the specific unpopular public policy positions he holds. Well, that too. But whatever the reason, it's hard to believe that a president could be reelected when more than half the country thinks he's doing a bad job. And if nothing so far has shaken Trump's unpopularity, what's going to happen in the next 19 months? So among the things that may happen in the next 19 months is we may go into recession, or at least have strong hints that that's the case. Right. And, of course, the actual Mueller report may come out, and it may have some actual news. And, dismissing that as, oh, that's not going to happen, I think is nuts.
Okay.
The whole reason that Barr was hired and this was done with the Barr Gambit and the get the good news out there, even if it's not true, was because of the possibility, the strong possibility. There's a lot of stuff in that report that is not going to make Trump look particularly good to the public.
Yes. Well, he doesn't look good now.
He doesn't look good now, but he's going to look even worse after that.
All right.
On the political front, this morning, Elizabeth Warren is a bit in political trouble. I've said this on the show before. I don't think her campaign is going all that well. I think she's got great policy. I think it's terrific that she's in the mix. I think it's terrific that she's releasing all of this. But I said at the time that her commitment to do small donor only was not a sign of strength. It was a sign of weakness. And in fact, this morning her finance director quit.
Oh. Well.
And said, you know what? She should have taken large donors.
Oh, yeah. Was that part of the quitting?
We're really in big trouble.
Oh. Well, that's not so good. I mean, I did see, I heard early, not so great news, and then lots of people saying, come on, this is a little early to be dismissing her, and I hadn't caught up on what happened. But that's not great. Certainly. Your finance director quits and says, this sucks. That would be a bit of a downer.
Yep.
But aren't you supposed to quit before the big deadline? Like all day yesterday was donate before the deadline. You should quit before the deadline.
Yesterday was the deadline, But anyway, I don't think that her campaign is sparking. It's not getting the same kind of press, for example, that Pete Buttigieg got, or Beto got, or Bernie got, or Kamala Harris got. I don't think she's she's running the same
to be sure.
successful rollout, shall we say. She seems to be in Kirsten Gillibrand rollout territory, which isn't good, or Amy Klobuchar territory, which isn't only good.
Well, I think she's doing better than them largely because of her policy. She's doing better than them
on the polls, but she didn't have great rollouts.
Okay. Well, it's not often that a big pile of solid policy positions and papers thrills the voting public to the point where you surge to the front of the polls, especially in a very crowded field where you can find anything you happen to be looking for.
Well, let's make the distinction between a quality run, which I think she has, right?
Yes.
And quality policy, which I think she has,
all right.
And politically doing well, which
I
don't think she is.
I mean, if you don't win, that's not doing well.
Well, yeah, I mean, and if
you
you're
put
not
on a good showing, certainly, but
if you're not in the top 3 or 4 or 5 in polling in multiple
10.
polls after you have, come out and run, that's not so good. Biden is a special case. He's a weird case. There's plenty of, uncomfortable, you're in my space stuff over the weekend, and he still leads in most of the polls.
Yes. I have been.
That's not a defense. It's an observation.
Yeah, that's not been easy to understand for me.
Well,
but
again,
okay.
Most people don't pay attention on the one hand.
Yes, there is that.
And on the other hand, he probably has the over 65 vote locked up. We don't care as much about that stuff.
I guess that's possibly true. I mean, there's going to be a lot of that. Well, he's from a different time. Well, I'm in this time, so what can I do about that now? I don't know, but I'm over 65, so I'm in his time.
I'm telling you, I wouldn't be shocked if he decides in the end not to run.
No, that would be fine. And I guess
it's
now
not a prediction. I don't know what he wants to do. There is no accounting for ego.
I guess not.
So I can't tell you what he's deciding, but he could step back and say, looking at the landscape, my pre-rollout isn't exactly going well either. It's not a juggernaut dominating. They can't wait for me to get in. In fact, I got to spend my entire election announcement doing apologies.
Yeah, that's not good. That's worse than not catching fire with a pile of awesome policy proposals.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we'll keep an eye on this. And, of course, I suppose, Elizabeth Warren could, it's a little early for dropouts, that's for sure. And I wouldn't ask her to do that. And I have no interest in it. And in fact, I don't know. How much money does it take to continue to push the field to match you on policy? Maybe that's the idea here.
Well, maybe you don't win on policy.
Oh, well, I don't know. Then what? All right, I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to do that. I'm not a campaign strategist for her, and nothing. I'll just wait and see.
Yeah. Well, just wait and see. That's not a bad idea. And then the final lightning round before the break is Trump deciding that he's going to cut off foreign aid to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, or as Fox News put this morning, the 3 Mexican countries.
Yeah, I saw that yesterday, and
they did that. They had a chyron that
I had to
Trump
check.
cuts off aid to 3 Mexican countries. He must have been thinking of Mexico, New Mexico, and Taco Bell.
Possibly, right. I run for the border. I don't know what I saw it yesterday. It was too early for it to be an April Fool's joke, but I did hesitate for a while. Like, did somebody Photoshop this? But I guess not. That is amazing.
Anyway, so cutting off aid to the countries where folks come from, as Rick Wilson says, which will make it more or less likely to generate large refugee flows. So it's like the president isn't very bright.
Yes, or as other people supposed, possibly looking to inflame the situation so that he has something that looks more like a crisis.
Evil. I don't think so. I go with not that bright.
Yeah, I mean, petty,
in other words,
vindictive,
we'll pick something
and
that sounds good, and let's not think about consequences.
Yeah, I mean, it might work for him, but might not. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Greg Dworkin's still with us briefly anyway. I know, early day, calling you in for all the, it's April Flu Day.
It's, flu's still going on, by the way. We're having a little bit less flu cases, but the bad news is that there's several different influenza A types that circulate. These days, H1N1, which is a remnant of the 2009 pandemic, is the milder, and that was circulating early in the year. Now it's H3N2, which hits older people and the young ones really hard. So there's less of it, but the one that's out there is still nasty, and that's a bad thing. By the way, the cases of measles just keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse. We talked on the show about the Rockland County outbreak and was having some discussions with public health people over the weekend on Twitter about this, and it's a really difficult scenario. In Rockland County, you have very observant Jews who happen to have a huge measles outbreak. Now, the fact that they happen to be very observant Jews has just about nothing to do with the fact that there is a huge measles outbreak. Unlike in other communities, there's no religious prescription for vaccination.
I see.
It's actually a different problem. Okay?
Yeah.
You have an insular community who is directed and I don't know that community all that well. I'm going by my experience working in medicine in New York City. There may be one Rebbe, but there's lots of rabbis within a community. Mm-hmm. Everybody's a scholar. Everybody's an expert.
Yes.
Right? Everybody knows everything. And they are told, they tell their constituents, if you will, mm-hmm. Stay off the internet. It's too secular.
Yeah.
Don't pay attention to news. It's all fake news. This has been going on for years and years and years and years, way before Trump. And we'll tell you, where you can go online. You can have religious chat rooms. There's certain places that are okay to do. And, of course, you can listen to us. Mm-hmm. So that's the setup in the background. And that makes those kinds of insular communities extremely susceptible to fake news. So, there's nothing specific religious Jewish about it. But if you get fake news about vaccination, you are just as, no more, no less, vaccine hesitant and susceptible to BS stories than the people in Marin County in California.
So no research and
you're not even allowed to go look it up and double check.
Yeah, so they both lead the same place.
So then you wind up with this, okay, maybe, I don't know, I heard all these stories about autism and maybe it's bad, and so I won't do it. And then you get a couple of low-level, again, I don't know the distinction, I'm getting the terminology wrong, but you get low-level management rabbis who buy into this and tell their constituents, okay, don't get vaccinated. Next thing you know, you have an under-vaccinated community, not because they're religious Jews, but because they've been given false information. So you have a low-level, non-vaccinated community, and then there's a measles outbreak. Now, if the surrounding community happens to have any sort of tendencies toward anti-Semitism, this doesn't help.
No, I guess it wouldn't.
Right? And so what do you do with that community? With public health, do you force them to do things? Do you bend the curve and be patient? What do you do? Because as we talked about on the show the other day, it's gotten to the point where a public health emergency has been declared, and people have been asked to keep their non-vaccinated children out of public spaces. But you can't enforce that. There's no way to enforce that. People don't walk around with identity cards showing whether or not you've been vaccinated, and you're not going to arrest them. So it's a nice thing to say if you want to get people's attention, which is the purpose, but it's not exactly enforceable. So what's the role of public health here in terms of pushing this? And it's the same role that public health has in pushing this issue with everybody else. You have to be pretty strict and stern about it when it comes to vaccination. Yes, you have to have school policy that says the kids can't be unvaccinated, and no, there should be no religious objection or personal exemption or philosophical exemption. There should only be medical exemption, and there are medical exemptions. Mm-hmm. There are people who cannot deal with live vaccines because, for example, they don't have a full immune system, they're on cancer drugs, so on and so forth. But if you don't push this early, then you're stuck with trying to push this message late, and it's really difficult now to come in with a heavy hand and say you have to do this and you have to do that. And so that's why it's kind of a good case study in terms of how this can go bad, and then what he's supposed to do about it to not make things worse. Yes.
I guess at this point there's also some danger of people taking the public health enforcement into their own hands and saying, well, the public officials can't enforce this public quarantine, and though there's nothing outward that will tell you whether
I resent that they're doing it. Well, you resent that they're doing this because you guys didn't do your job early.
Yeah. Well, it's and it comes out in problematic ways. How can you tell who's vaccinated and not vaccinated? You can't. However, there are outward markers that would indicate that somebody belongs to this community in which there's been this outbreak, and people just might take those signals as, well, we're in danger if they're around, and we ought to do what we can to drive them from public spaces.
So here's a story to go with that for your readers later. An outbreak spreads fear of measles of ultra-Orthodox Jews of anti-Semitism A measles outbreak in a New York suburb has sickened scores of people and stoked long, smoldering tensions between the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community and the secular world at large.
Yes.
So, very, very interesting read. And again, I grew up practicing medicine in an area that had fairly tight and separate communities. And this is not the only community where, as a physician, if you want to treat the kids, you have to convince not just the parents, but the elders in the community, whoever those elders are.
Yes.
Whether it's a Romani population, also known as gypsies, or whether it's a Orthodox Jewish population. There's many populations like that,
I guess,
where it's a community thing, and you really got to convince the heads of the community, not just the parents.
And a lot of things, even non-religious sects. Just, hey, town elders, they happen to occupy positions that can keep you kicked out.
Right. Now, if you happen to have a community that has the resentment of non-community members who happen to surround and neighbor them, and this can only make it worse, you can see how the problem just grows. Spreads like measles.
Well.
Right? So it's bad. The other story that caught my eye is Why Courtrooms Are Kryptonite for Alex Jones. This is by Charlie Warles in the New York Times. Shock jocks lose their power when forced to tell the truth, the whole truth. And there I add nothing but the truth. Nothing like a 3-hour deposition under oath to turn an excitable conspiracy theorist into a man subdued, deferential, and humble. That's the Alex Jones who the world met for the first time on Friday when attorneys for families of the victims posted his deposition online. The deposition was given earlier this month in conjunction with a number of lawsuits on behalf of parents of victims of the attack in 2012, 2012, at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Mr. Jones, the longtime misinformation peddler and founder of the radio and online show InfoWars, is being sued for defamation for saying repeatedly during his broadcasts that parts of the Sandy Hook shooting were staged and that the tragedy was a false flag operation designed to take away firearms from American citizens. For anyone familiar with his broadcasting style, the deposition is a jarring piece of evidence. It's perhaps the most revealing portrait of Jones, or as the Times call him, Mr. Jones, one that strips bare the bloviating host to expose a huckster. So that's why Trump didn't want to testify under oath.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's largely the same reason, yeah.
On camera and in public, the stocky Texan is famous for his meandering soliloquies and belligerent, occasionally violent verbal outbursts. Trump Jones.
Yeah, I'm not Texan.
Right? It's never quite clear whether he'll laugh and burst into song, pound the table in a fit of rage, or begin dramatically weeping.
Yes, and he did a bit of weeping in this process, I understand.
Right. So portions of the deposition are vintage InfoWars. Mr. Jones blames the media, suggests he's actually the person who's the victim, casts doubt on the veracity of the InfoWars clips the lawyers have presented to him as evidence, and suggest they've been heavily edited and the audio was altered. This is exactly Trump. This is where Trump gets his stuff.
Yeah.
But Trump was doing it way longer than Jones. So that's why there's so much fun. Now, near the end of the questioning, Mr. Jones suggested his claims about the Sandy Hook massacre were the result of a mental disorder. He said he had almost had a form of psychosis back in the past where I basically thought everything was staged, even though I'm now learning a lot of times things aren't staged.
Oh. Like this trial.
Right? And these are video clips. This new set of video clips, a new set of viral clips burst the myth of Alex Jones, presenting him in a situation he can't engineer and he can't spin. He's a man who has lost control of the narrative, and it's this performance, more than any ruling from the judge, that poses the greatest threat to the InfoWars empire. So let's hope so. Because when you see people in real life actually having to tell the truth, it really kind of destroys the grift.
Yeah. Well, if it happens enough.
Again, that's why Trump didn't want to get deposed under oath.
Yeah.
That's why his buddies like Rudy Giuliani wouldn't let that happen.
And that's why you're not allowed to see him play golf.
Yeah, and of course, with the recent suicide of a Newtown parent, I mean, this is part of the constant pressure that's always there from jerks like this. So having the book thrown at him is fine by me. I think it's just a great thing.
Yeah, and it's it's not even the criminal book that they're throwing.
No, let the public relations, yeah, he really is a fraud. It's the face in the crowd, let's leave the microphone open moment, and great.
Okay.
That's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's my segment for today.
Okay.
This is Greg Dworkin speaking with my good friend David Waldman. Kagro in the morning. You've got 15 minutes more of stuff, and then an hour's worth more of more stuff.
Right.
What are you going to talk about?
Well, I am going to talk
either.
about the president's golf game. That much I know.
He cheats.
Yeah, and how. So, more reporting on that. We'll definitely discuss that and what that means, which is to say not much, but it gives us an opportunity to vent at how ridiculous he is.
Yeah, I think it's good.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so remember, no matter what you hear with the nonsense in the press, the public knows better. Everybody's waiting for the report, and when the actual report comes out, and eventually in some form it will, it's going to have an impact because people aren't really expecting anything because they don't know what to expect. That means it's tabula rasa, and we'll see what happens, at least for a third of the country. The third of the country that watches Fox News is immovable, but they don't count. It's everybody else. Take care, and I'll talk to you on Wednesday.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Greg. 1/3 of the Mexicos also watches Fox News as well. So, that's a reason for them to be upset and annoyed. So I don't know. I think we're done with that particular story. That was amazing. I had to search around to see whether that was a fake. And I was going to be I was all set to be extraordinarily annoyed by it. A, if it was a fake, and B, if it was a fake and it didn't even wait for April Fool's Day to be a fake. But I guess that turns out to be true. I know it's true because it was reported in The Hill. Well, it was reported everywhere, of course. People were circulating it all day long. And finally, I guess the only news outlet that saw fit, one, to cover the story, and two, to circulate their coverage of it on Twitter, where that's where you would want to interface with the story because that's kind of where it was popularized. But I'm sure that other outlets more credible than The Hill also reported on the story. But The Hill, I will say, they are masters at getting their message in front of me. I don't know whether that's worth anything, but I disseminate it, so I assume it's worth something. Although I do so with a spoonful of salt almost all the time. But I would say the current best Twitter timeline manipulators, in my view, and I mean that in my field of vision, have been The Hill and the Pete Buttigieg campaign, quite honestly. From early days, they've been excellent at seeding that section of the Twitter sphere that gets on my screen a lot. I see every big splashy news story that they're trying to circulate, and only a small portion of the criticism. So a great example of giving someone undue coverage in a news-like atmosphere, I guess we could say, and having me come away with the impression that, there's a lot of excitement about this person. And although I have realized all along that most of what I was seeing, I've started paying particular attention to who was retweeting it into my timeline, and I could then figure out what was going on. But it's also worked nationally. So I guess that means I'm not all that unusual in that, and or that targeting works, and you just have to be aware of it. But reporting on the fact that it's underway and working is still worth noting as well, especially if it's going to make a big difference in the polls, and then people use that as whitewash to say, see, he's popular because reasons, as opposed to popular because we said it a lot. That's all the same here in this country. So at some point, there's really no point in distinguishing between the two. Anyway, he's been very entertaining to watch. He, among a good half dozen or so of the Democratic candidates who have consistent, and non-candidates, by the way, still AOC enjoying the spotlight and having the ability to create viral video moments that circulate and win converts of all sorts inside the Democratic ranks, of course. There are very few are able to win converts in Republican ranks, unless it's among never Trumpers and the narrowing gap there. But anyway, I guess kudos to the PR team for him and for a couple others. And I don't know whether AOC maintains such a team or not, but she certainly doesn't in primitive form, but not on large format like you're supposed to do in presidential campaigns. But it's working pretty well for her. Okay, so let's see. We got the Hills report confirming that Fox News actually put the 3 Mexican countries gaffe up on screen. Gladys McCormick, an opinion writer, contributing the piece that was so headlined. She is an assistant professor of history in Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, or as they call it in the UK, Syracuse University. Did you know that? I only found that out by going to the UK on Syracuse University's semester abroad program 8,000 years ago. And I was surprised by that pronunciation, and it's always stuck with me. I don't think there is anyone in America that refers to it that way. And as a matter of fact, a couple of times that I've run into UK transplants living here in America, they have, those who have reason to say the name of the university anyway, have largely swapped pronunciations because they get either confused looks or angry pushback. And I don't know. Just one of those things. Anyway, Fox News' 3 Mexican countries gaffe perfectly sums up Trump's policies. And I thought that was a nice headline because it kind of does. So the real story underlying it all, of course, is the cutoff of aid. And I think, the correct analysis was the 10-second analysis we mentioned earlier. That will likely only exacerbate the problem. Just before break, I was discussing the possibility people are just, discussing between themselves that it could be the case that the Trump administration knows very well that will only inflame the situation, and they might be looking to inflame the situation so that refugee outflow increases, and they can point to that as evidence of the border crisis that they always insisted was happening. But Greg pushing back on that one, and I think rightly so. It should always be noted that although that could work to his advantage, that does not necessarily mean it was anything planned by Trump. He would arrive at the same conclusion by simply shooting from the hip and saying, I don't like brown people, so I'm not giving them money. It's not his money to give, there's all that, but leaving all of that aside, he believes he's in unilateral control of the government. And why would we do such a thing? And that does make a certain amount of sense. And the idea that he would plan ahead, people may have told him, well, the real result of all this could be that you will make the refugee situation worse, but don't worry, that's okay, because it would look then more like the crisis that you've described. And he might have nodded and said, sure, great. But I doubt very much whether he said, what can I do in order to develop this situation further to my advantage? Because he would land on the wrong thing if that was the case. All right, let's see. Moving on, I did mention there is a Trump golf story out there. And I guess it's the New York Post has run the piece that has the golf world talking about Donald Trump, and it is an unimportant thing on the whole, but something that I have enjoyed harping on for quite some time, and it gives me another opportunity to remind people that you can find out the truth about Trump's golfing pretty easily through the magic of the internet, and we'll get to that reminder in just a second. Trump is the world's worst cheat at golf, players and celebs say. This by Gavin Newsom, published in the New York Post. And is Gavin Newsom one of their own or what? Anyway, I guess so. Let's see. But here's the story. 16 of the last 19 U.S. presidents have played golf, and now in Donald John Trump, the nation can finally boast the very best of them all. And I guess really, sure, right. Well, that's what he would like you to believe. Anyway, and I guess that's what makes this story so intriguing, is that he's not just a cheat, but such a cheat and such a liar. And he does cheat in extraordinarily shameful ways. It's just that he has no shame. To say Donald Trump cheats, it is said here, is like saying Michael Phelps swims, writes Rick Riley in the new book, Commander-in-Cheat, How Golf Explains Trump. How do you like that? And that apparently is coming out, well, it says Tuesday, and I guess that would be tomorrow, because this is dated March 30th. So tomorrow, not April Fool's Day, but the next day, out comes the book. He cheats at the highest level, record-breaking cheating. Am I right? He cheats when people are watching, and he cheats when they aren't. He cheats whether you like it or not. He cheats because that's how he plays golf. If you're playing golf with him, he's going to cheat. And, okay, I think we knew that, but there is new information in here. Riley, a former Sports Illustrated columnist who has played with Trump in the past, spoke to dozens of players, both amateur and professional, to recount some of the president's worst cons on the course, starting with his declared handicap of 2.8. Okay, if you don't get that, the article then continues in layman's terms. The lower the handicap, the better the player. Jack Nicklaus, perhaps you've heard of him, winner of a record 18 major golf titles and generally considered the greatest golfer in the history of the game, has, at least currently as an older player, a handicap of 3.4. Remember Trump claiming a 2.8. Nicklaus's handicap is listed on the same Golf Handicap and Information Network website used by Trump, where players post their scores. The idea, of course, is that you would post every score. Donald Trump just posts his best ones. That's how it comes out. If Trump is a 2.8, writes Riley, Queen Elizabeth is a pole vaulter. So congratulations to Her Majesty on that one. Shortly after he became president, Trump played with Tiger Woods, the current world number one Dustin Johnson, and the veteran PGA Tour pro Brad Faxon. It's an interesting pairing, but not an unusual one. It could happen any time, except for the president being in there. Given the quality and profile of his companions, you might have thought Trump would have been on his best behavior. Not so. Of course, Trump doesn't have good behavior. It's very difficult to tell whether he's on his best or his worst. It's just one kind. On one hole, well, I mean, I guess that could be argued that he was on his best behavior. That's just as good as he gets. On one hole, Trump dunked a shot into the lake. You're not supposed to hit it in the lake. That, I think you all know. But as his opponents weren't looking, he simply dropped another ball and then hit that ball into the water too. So you can't miss two splashes, right? So he drives up and he drops where he should have dropped the first time and hits it on the green, recalls Faxon. And I guess if you don't play golf, you wouldn't know necessarily what that actually means. Like you hit a ball and it goes into the water. You're not supposed to just drop another one, right? I mean, I guess that's available to you as an option, but you're supposed to say so. You tell everybody what you're doing when you drop another ball. But you're supposed to go to a different spot, and there's rules about, okay, if you hit it into the water, where do you put a new ball? You can't go into the lake and get yours, and you have to use a new ball, obviously, but there's elaborate rules about where you put the ball down, and you're not supposed to just put it wherever you want it, and you're not supposed to place it there. You're supposed to drop it from shoulder height, and, you know, if it rolls a little bit, that's the breaks. That's the way the game is played. But obviously he doesn't observe any of that, and he doesn't go to the right spot. And if you don't go to the right spot and you don't tell everybody what you're doing, there's supposed to be penalties involved in that too. But then basically, no. So he drops another ball, a third ball, actually, and then pow, hits it right to the green and then pretends like those other two shots didn't happen. All right. The actor Samuel L. Jackson has also witnessed the underhanded methods Trump employs, according to Riley. We clearly saw him hook a ball into a lake. This is a different time. At Trump National at Bedminster, New Jersey. And he says his caddy told him he found it. Like, okay, you hit the ball into the lake. You didn't go in the lake and go scuba diving for it, right? Oh, I found the ball. It splashed into the water, hit a narwhal, and went into his blowhole, and he shot it back out right onto the fairway. It's weird. I mean, play it as it lies. The guy doesn't say anything in the rule book about whether blowholes can affect the lie of your ball. Anyway, oh my God, this is getting terrible. Anyway, and I don't know why they had narwhals in fresh water. I don't really know exactly how it happened, but that's what the guy reported. A lot of things wrong with that, of course. If you hit the ball into the water, it's in the water. You can't find it on dry land, although I have seen balls skip across ponds before, but then you don't find it where he found it. 2, of course, it was found by his caddy, and if you have all seen what little footage there is available of Trump golfing. Is usually filmed by other people out on the golf course because he doesn't let the press go out there when he's golfing because he cheats and he doesn't want them to see it. You see him, he drives his golf cart all over the place, even on the greens, which is strictly forbidden in most instances. But he drives a golf cart everywhere, which means that his bags don't have to be carried, which leads you to wonder something like, again, if you don't know how, not a golf player, you might not, this might not occur to you, but if you're riding in a cart and your golf bag is on the back of the cart, you don't need a caddy. You don't typically take a caddy with you whose job it is ordinarily to carry the bags if the bags are strapped to the back of the cart. The golf cart obviates the need for a caddy. Now, there is one other reason why you might take a caddy with you, and a caddy could give you local knowledge of the course. They know the course inside and out. They know the contours of the course. They know where you want to place the ball for the best shots. So sometimes they can be very valuable to a player who isn't familiar with the course. But of course, Trump only plays on his own courses, and he's intimately familiar, or should be. Maybe he doesn't have a great brain after all. So bringing a caddy with you while you're driving in a cart is highly suspect, especially when it's on a course you play all the time. But we'll talk about that after this break. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just a short break to catch your breath. And, unfortunately that means there's more golf stories to tell. And, the reason I spent a little bit of time going over the fact that, he's both driving a cart and taking a caddy with him is that, there's no reason for that caddy to be there except to do things like find balls that were clearly shot into lakes. And there's another example up here, that comes up next. But basically what we're saying here is he employs a caddy for the purpose of facilitating cheating that he knows he's going to be doing during the round, which is an extraordinary way of approaching anything, golf included. Next up, the boxer Oscar de la Hoya and rocker Alice Cooper have also seen the same shenanigans firsthand, while LPGA player Suzanne Peterson, another victim, thinks it's all down to his caddy. See, it is. Since no matter how far into the woods he hits the ball, it's in the middle of the fairway when we get there. And again, the caddy thing. Like a caddy carries your bags and advises you on the game as you go. Trump's caddy spends next to no time with Trump and doesn't carry his bags. He goes and finds the ball, which if you're a good golfer, you don't need because it's in the short grass. The grass is green, the ball is white. You go to the white spot in the middle of the grass, and then you take a look. If you have any doubt about whether that's your ball or another player's ball, you take a look at the markings on the ball, figure it out. You don't need caddies to go ahead of you for any reason. I guess as a professional golfer, you might occasionally send your caddy ahead to take a look, on a blind shot and say, all right, I'm going to show you about where you want to hit to and what's the visible field in front of you in order to place the shot where you want it. Aim for where I am now, and then I'll move out of the way. that sort of thing. But Trump would have no need of a caddy going ahead of him except to do things like, wow, it really looked like you hit that ball like 100 yards into the woods, but boy, it must have hit a tree and bounced straight out into the middle of the fairway, perfectly placed for an easy shot to the green for the 957th time in a row. How lucky you are, Mr. President. And of course, this was going on well before he was president. He just was a rich guy who wanted people to... he can't even have wanted people to believe he was a good golfer. He just, I don't know, whatever. He wanted himself to believe it, and he didn't care what they thought. I guess that's the case. So, all of that having been said, and all of those stories having been told, you must think he's a despicable person, and you would be right. But we're not done. As annoying as it is, as dishonorable as it is to cheat at golf in that way, that's not the worst thing you can do. I've played golf enough times, and with enough, with poor enough players, and myself included, to know that sometimes you just say, well, why would I frustrate myself? I don't really care about what the score is per se, because I'm going to monkey with it one way or another. Give myself an extra shot here or there. A lot of times people say first ball, first tee, it drives no good. That's where the people say, take a mulligan. Or, as my stepfather says, take a breakfast ball. Well, you just ate breakfast. You're not ready to swing the clubs. Take another shot. So, do things like that. Or I hit the ball into the woods and it's gone, I'm like, all right, well, I'm not even going to look for it. And I'll drop a ball, I don't know, right about here. I don't know what the real rule is. I'll just drop it right around here. But I usually will say, all right, so I'll give myself a penalty there and drop another ball and then count an extra shot in there. You hit one into the woods, the pretend shot of finding the ball and hitting it back out of the woods to where you are, where you've dropped, is number 2. And then you're hitting the third shot there. Or sometimes I play with a group that says, we're all going to not take penalties. Just, whatever. An approximate score or whatever. We're not competing. We usually don't bet anything, bet any money or any other sort of thing. Just why punish yourself? You're out to have a good time. So among really amateur golfers, that happens. When you're playing with, people that either you want to impress because they're big golfers or whatever, you try and keep things right. But whatever you do to your own score, a little bit of fudging and cheating, if it's agreed to, if you're with competitive people, is probably not so bad with your own score. What you don't do is mess with other people's experience. This is their golf outing. They can play the way they feel comfortable, or, they're out to have a good time too. And so this situation is just particularly galling. During a game with Mike Tirico, before Trump was elected, the former ESPN football announcer hit the shot of his life, a 230-yard 3-wood towards an elevated green he couldn't see, but he knew it was close. So that's like a really exciting thing that as an amateur golfer, you would take home with you, and tell the family when you go back, how's the golfing? Mike, oh, it was great. I had a great shot. You should have seen it. At 230 yards out, I took a 3-wood and I just killed it. And just beautiful shot. It was and I got up to the green, and wouldn't you know it, it's 10 feet from the green for an eagle putt, whatever it was, eagle, birdie, whatever. You live for those moments. So, of course, Trump has to destroy that moment, because not only does he have to be the greatest golfer in the world, everyone else has to suck in order for him to feel good about himself, because he's a hollow, disgusting shell of a human being and doesn't deserve to be anywhere near the presidency, obviously, but also should probably be, launched into the sun. He's horrible. He's a horrible person. Guy has a nice day, great golf outing, by all accounts, beautiful course, playing with a famous guy, hits the shot of his life. Trump sends his caddy up there. Guess what happens? When he got to the putting green, Tirico's ball was nowhere to be seen. Instead, it was 50 feet left of the hole in a bunker. Oh, wait, I made this sound less horrible than it really is. I said he sent his caddy up there. He did send his caddy up there, but check this out. So instead of having the greatest shot of his life, he had a okay shot. I mean, really, honestly, 230-yard 3-wood to an elevated green, 50 feet left in a bunker is not a bad thing, not a bad shot, really, from there. But it made no sense that he knew where the green was, and he knew that that should be awesome. You get the sense of that as a golfer. I got the right direction, I got the right distance, I really got all of the ball. So it made no sense until Trump's caddy caught up with him after the round. Trump's caddy came up to me and he said, "You know that shot you hit on the par 5? Tirico says, "It was about 10 feet from the hole," just where he thought it was going to be. Trump threw it in the bunker. I watched him do it. He was sent up there to help the man cheat, but Trump decided to do it himself. Trump goes ahead of his... Now, that's another thing. Just like in terms of golf courtesy. What is Trump doing up at the green before the guy he's playing with gets there? He's up there because he, too, knows the shot's going to be good, and he has to go up there and make it look bad. He robs the guy of the shot of his life. And for what? I don't know. Just to be Trump, I guess. Even Trump's golf courses lie. The piece continues, and I think most of this stuff you've actually heard before. As the owner of 14 golf clubs and with his name on another 5, Trump has, according to Riley, been known to wildly exaggerate their standing in course rankings, to overvalue them, and even play fast and loose with their locations. At Trump Washington at Lowe's Island. Is that what they call it now? Trump Washington at Lowe's Island? Anyway, that's the one near me. There's a Civil War monument. You've heard this one, bearing Trump's name, obviously, between the 14th and 15th holes, reminding golfers of how many soldiers from North and South died at this very spot. But, of course, there never was a battle at that spot. The course at Bedminster, New Jersey, has a plaque with a quote from the renowned course architect, Tom Fazio. It reads, "This is the best design I've ever done, Tom Fazio." Except that's not true either. And I don't know whether he says Fazio or not. That's a big mystery to me. Anyway, the man himself, though, says, "I don't believe I said it exactly like that." So who knows what he actually said, but Trump thinks he does. "This is the best design I've ever done." All right. Well, there's lots more, not a whole lot more, actually. But those were the takeaways from a much discussed and much disgusting golf story over the weekend about Donald Trump. It was incredible, the depth of his depravity, I guess, essentially. And I mean, I think I only spent this much time on it because I think it's illustrative of what kind of person he is. That even when it doesn't matter for anything, he still cheats, and not only does he cheat to make himself look better, he cheats to make other people look worse, and I think that's despicable. And so do you. We're in agreement on that, and that's enough. We can move on from there. All right. Let's see. Other material that we need to cover. Well, we did mention right up top that House Dems are ready to authorize subpoenas for the Mueller report and key witnesses on Wednesday. We should read Jen Hayden's report on that so that we get the names on record of who's being subpoenaed and get the full story. Jerry Nadler and the Dems on the House Judiciary Committee are not at all satisfied with the fan fiction from Bill Barr, nor are they satisfied with his pledge to release some heavily redacted version in mid-April. So it's good they're not even waiting to see whether his next version is disappointing or not. They're clear on what they want. They want the Mueller report, the whole thing, unredacted. And, of course, they say they also want access to the grand jury material, and we can read a little bit about what odds they're facing there. So it's a good thing, as disappointed as I am in the fact that we're playing the subpoena game again. And I understand, that to some extent that's the way you're going to have to do it. Hardly anybody pays attention in this country. Still fewer would have been paying attention last time we went through this subpoena game and remember it. So you got to do it again every once in a while. But at least they're beginning to short circuit things. Barr has a Tuesday, April 2nd, that's tomorrow, deadline to deliver the report to Congress. And House Democrats are already preparing to issue several key subpoenas relating to the Mueller report. I guess the vote being scheduled for Wednesday, anticipating a failure to deliver the report tomorrow. From Politico's coverage of the issue, Jen quotes the following. Under the proposal, Nadler would determine when to actually issue the subpoenas, which may depend on the level of cooperation and transparency Democrats get from the Justice Department. Nadler has said he is, quote, disturbed by Barr's reticence to share the full report immediately and has asked him to join the committee in seeking a judge's approval to release all grand jury information in Mueller's report. In addition, Nadler says the committee will also issue subpoenas to former Trump campaign chief executive Steve Bannon, who they believe is alive. So, we'll see what the courts think about that one. Former Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, former White House counsel Don McGahn, and former Communications Director, how does she do it, Hope Hicks. House Dems want the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. It is, after all, the American way, Jen reminds us. In an opinion editorial from the New York Times, for the New York Times, Nadler explains why House Dems are moving forward with subpoenas, and I think Greg mentioned that. Did he quote from that one? I'm not entirely certain. But Nadler gives it his best go at explaining why they ought to hand the report over. The entire reason, as I think this is the part that Greg read us, the entire reason for appointing the special counsel was to protect the investigation from political influence. By offering us his version of events in lieu of the report, the Attorney General, a recent political appointee, undermines the work and integrity of his department. He also denies the public the transparency it deserves. We require the full report, the special counsel's words, not the Attorney General's summary or a redacted version. We require the report first because Congress, not the Attorney General, has the duty under the Constitution to determine whether wrongdoing has occurred. The special counsel declined to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment on the question of obstruction, but it is not the Attorney General's job to step in and substitute his judgment for the special counsel's. Open question, of course, in light of the fact that the Supreme Court has been so radically tilted to the right by Trump and others. Anyway, that responsibility, Nadler says, falls to Congress, and specifically to the House Judiciary Committee, as it has in every similar investigation in modern history. The Attorney General's recent proposal to redact the special counsel's report before we receive it is unprecedented. We require the evidence, not whatever remains after the report has been filtered by the president's political appointee. Nadler also notes that if Donald Trump's behavior fell just outside of criminal lines but clearly crossed ethical lines, Congress has a duty to change the law to prevent further abuses. By the way, I would say you don't necessarily have to restrict yourself from impeaching him for those reasons either, but okay. And Nadler concludes, I guess, when the full scope of the president's misconduct has been revealed, when his lies are debunked and his abuses have been laid bare, I believe that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle will draft legislation to curb the worst of his offenses. Put another way, if President Trump's behavior wasn't criminal, then perhaps it should have been. That is an interesting approach to things, although I don't know for sure whether it will, I don't know whether anything will convince Republican courts, and we should refer to them that way, whether anything would convince Republican courts to agree that Congress has this right or has this duty, or whether it matters if they do or not. But we also, of course, don't know that there's any opportunity to change things legislatively. I mean, we do still face a Republican Senate as well, and they may very well just end up standing in the way of legislation to, well, not set things right, but erect barriers, build a wall, if you will, to prevent future such abuses. even though I don't know if there's ever going to be anyone capable of the level of abuse that Donald Trump was able to bring to bear. All right, maybe now would be a good time to turn back around and read fully through NYC Southpaw's piece that I mentioned last show, I think on Friday. Lupin, writing in Yahoo News, in pursuit of Mueller's grand jury materials, Democrats face an impeachment dilemma. So hold this up against where Nadler begins his subpoena game, and realize, okay, so we're talking about Jerry Nadler saying you got to give us the whole report because it's Congress's responsibility to evaluate what happened here. And even if what he did wasn't criminal, perhaps it should have been, and it would be a critical input for us in legislating in order to prevent future abuses, to have all of this information, including the grand jury material. There is a problem with that, or a potential problem. And, at this level, and in this gray area of the law, you never know whether, maybe it is a problem, maybe it isn't. Maybe people are willing to overlook it. Maybe people will erect even more barriers to the release of the material they're looking for. We'll start over because I don't think we got very far into this, and I think it's an important piece to analyze. In the aftermath of the special counsel's investigation, Washington is girding for a conflict between Capitol Hill and the Department of Justice over Congress's and the public's access to the contents of special counsel Robert Mueller's report and the evidence collected by his investigation, including the grand jury evidence. However, there is a complication that neither congressional Democrats nor the Department of Justice appear ready to acknowledge or discuss. They may know it, but aren't ready to discuss it. The strength of the legal authority supporting lawmakers' demand for grand jury evidence depends in part on whether those materials are sought in connection with an impeachment inquiry, something party leaders have publicly disavowed. I'm not for impeachment, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said in a Washington Post magazine interview earlier last month. Now it's last month. You remember the whole thing. This is the one that he's just not worth it. Impeachment's so divisive, yada, yada. We remember her comments on it. The battle over grand jury material was already alluded to in Attorney General William Barr's letter to Congress on last Sunday, in which the previous Sunday, I guess, a week from yesterday, in which he noted the special counsel's report contains grand jury evidence that would be kept under wraps, citing the general procedural rule governing secrecy of these proceedings. In other words, ordinarily, you don't release grand jury evidence. So he was going to cling to that and say, the reason I'm redacting the report, his first excuse for any redaction at all was, well, as you know, we can't just let grand jury material leak out. We are bound by law to protect that, so we're going to redact that from the report we give to Congress so that it doesn't leak any further. And in fact, the argument was that we wouldn't even be authorized to show the grand jury material to Congress, even if we believed that it wouldn't leak any further. So that was the first go-round of this excuse. The heads of congressional investigating committees, in response, have signaled that they expect Mueller's entire report and everything that he gathered, including the grand jury materials, to be turned over. In their reply to Barr, the committee chairs noted, without going into detail, that there's legal authority for the release of grand jury materials to Congress under similar circumstances. All right. I think we got at least this far. And discussing it last week. Democratic House and Senate staffs have confirmed that they want the evidence. We expect the grand jury materials. Remember this one? Shadon Reddick Smith, spokesman for the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, said. A spokesman for Senate Judiciary Ranking Member Dianne Feinstein, Tom Mentzer, added that Democrats' calls for the Mueller report and underlying evidence would certainly include the grand jury materials. But that means Democrats leading the House investigative committees will have to convince the Department of Justice lawyers that turning over grand jury materials to Congress is permissible, or go to court to compel the production of those materials, which would mean, of course, that they would have to convince judges that the release of grand jury materials to Congress is permissible. Now, they have said that it's been done before, right? Well, under similar circumstances. So, of course, the job would then be to illustrate that the circumstances are substantially similar here, close enough that you could, by analogy, come to the conclusion that the grand jury materials ought to be released, or at least to Congress. If Democrats frame their requests as preliminary to a potential impeachment proceeding, they would likely be on stronger legal footing, because it would make an exception to the general rule of grand jury secrecy available to them, one that would likely not be available for a simple oversight request. Or, in other words, a request that, well, we're thinking of doing some legislation to prevent the worst abuses that are revealed in this report from happening again. That would come under the same heading, oversight, or, even for legislative interest specifically, doesn't measure up necessarily in the same way as, well, we need it because it's evidence for impeachment. And, some judges might agree, some judges might not. Some judges might say, well, certainly legislative purposes are as important as anything, that they're central to the role of the legislature. And if they can have them for impeachment, which is, certainly arguably important, but not the primary function of the legislative branch, then they ought to be able to have it, you would think, sensibly enough, for their primary purposes as well. But not everyone would agree. Adopting the stronger legal position to obtain investigative materials would run the risk of contradicting the political messaging of Democratic leaders, including Pelosi, who have sought to take impeachment off the table. And indeed, the first pass at this effort, of course, coming from Jerry Nadler, makes no mention at all about impeachment, and quite intentionally so. So, House and Senate Democrats declined to answer questions about the specifics of their precedent and whether it may be influenced by impeachment. The Department of Justice, likewise, did not respond to repeated requests for comment. Grand jury secrecy is a long-established tradition under the common law. I think this is about the point which we were unable to continue last time we discussed this. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution makes the grand jury an integral part of federal criminal investigations. It provides, in part, that, quote, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. Accordingly, unless a cooperative defendant is willing to waive the requirement, every federal prosecutor must obtain the agreement of a grand jury in order to bring serious criminal charges. While this requirement is a theoretical check on the prosecutor's power, a commonplace joke is that a grand jury, if asked by prosecutors, will indict a ham sandwich. That is the old joke, and I don't really know why people feel so bad about ham sandwiches, but okay. The grand jury is also a potent investigative tool, a venerable institution of the common law that the first American colonies, first the American colonies and then the United States, inherited from England. Grand juries have extraordinary investigative powers and scope. The grand jury consists of 16 to 23 citizens drawn at random from the jurisdiction where the criminal proceeding is expected to be held. In starting an investigation, grand juries are not constrained by any burden of proof. The Supreme Court has written that a grand jury may investigate merely on suspicion that the law is being violated, or even just because it wants assurance that it is not. Probable cause, which is required in other criminal proceedings, is the end point of the grand jury's work. A grand jury, in other words, has the ability to compel a person to provide testimony or documents without any required pretext. And because lying to a grand jury is a serious felony, prosecutors are able to use these proceedings to extract detailed and intimate information. By tradition, these investigations are secret. Congress codified that secrecy as part of the federal rules on criminal proceedings, which prohibit grand jurors or prosecutors from disclosing matters that occur before the grand jury, subject to several exceptions where disclosure is allowed. In his letter to Congress last Sunday, Barr indicated that one of the first steps in his processing of Mueller's report would be identifying grand jury materials that by law cannot be made public, but left out any discussion of any of the exceptions. But we'll be back to discuss some of those after this break. We'll be 2 minutes and back in your face after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We'll continue with our discussion and reading of as you know him, him, I believe, NYC Southpaw from Twitter, writing here in Yahoo News under his real name, Lupe Lupin, which I hope I'm pronouncing anything like what he would prefer. And she, I have no idea what the pronoun that's proper here is. But, well, it's just a dog picture on Twitter, so I have no idea. Anyway, continuing on with this, I think, very interesting and important piece of the puzzle. The exceptions was where we left off. There was no discussion in Barr's letter, no acknowledgement that there were exceptions to the rule that ordinarily would keep grand jury materials secret from everyone, including Congress. The exceptions for disclosures to other governmental attorneys, there are lots of exceptions, and they include, I should frame it this way, other government attorneys and also other government personnel for purposes of law enforcement. They also allow for disclosure to counterintelligence or counterterrorism operatives, or a judge can authorize the disclosure of grand jury information in connection with a judicial proceeding or in the exercise of the court's inherent authority. And remember, keep thinking about inherent authorities that belong both to the courts and to Congress. But for these purposes, we're talking about the court's inherent authority over grand jury matters. So, not a whole lot of exceptions, but the rest of the government can take a look at it for purposes of law enforcement, counterintelligence, or counterterrorism. Or judges can disclose grand jury information in connection with a judicial proceeding or in the exercise of the court's own inherent authority over grand jury matters. The executive branch can see it for law enforcement. The judicial branch can see it for judicial proceedings. It doesn't necessarily say anything about Congress. But a number of courts have found that Congress can rely on the established exceptions in certain situations. Although no exception to grand jury secrecy explicitly encompasses disclosures to Congress, the Congressional Research Service wrote in a summary published in January, a few of the exceptions could apply to Congress in particular situations, and I believe actually have. The CRS summary points out that the judicial proceedings exception is likely available to Congress, but only in an impeachment scenario. The House chairs echoed that general statement in their letter back to Barr, writing, "There is precedent for the release of such materials to Congress under similar circumstances," but they did not get into any specifics. In other words, they didn't talk about what circumstances are similar enough to a judicial proceeding to make their point explicit. But it doesn't take that much thinking to realize what they're talking about here. In what context would legislative branch activity be similar to a judicial proceeding? And the answer, of course, and really the only answer that there can be, is when they are considering an impeachment. When, in such a case, the House acts as grand jury and opts whether or not to indict someone, to impeach them specifically, and the Senate, who is, depending on your view of exactly what the Constitution means, thereafter obligated, and I hear, we put that in quotes, what does an obligation to the Senate actually mean? But it's been understood in our Schoolhouse Rock view of things that if the House were to impeach a person, whatever office they might occupy, the Senate would then be obligated to conduct the trial in all of this. And it is referred to as a trial, and it is handled in a way that's analogous to a trial. And when the president is the person being impeached, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sits in the Senate to preside over the trial. Evidence is presented, statements from both sides, the defense is presented, and the Senate votes as a 100-member jury. Petty jury, not grand jury. The grand jury side is over on the House side. So that's very much an analog to a judicial proceeding. And I guess the precedent that the chairs of the House committees were referring to in releasing grand jury material to Congress used exactly that analog. They wouldn't name it. They said there are certain circumstances under which a congressional proceeding could be likened to a judicial proceeding, and that excuse, that analog has worked before. Courts have ruled, yes, you can send the grand jury material to Congress for their judicial-like proceeding. And, like we said, that was for, in the context of an impeachment. But for whatever reason, the letter doesn't say so. We know whatever the reason is, though. We know what the whatever is, and that is that Democrats, as a party under Nancy Pelosi in the House, have determined that it's in their best political interest to avoid discussion of the I word. So they just left it out. And courts aren't stupid. They'll know what they're talking about. But then again, courts are also, here's the flip side of their not being stupid is they say, I know you're talking about impeachment, but that's not going on here as far as I can tell, or there's nothing explicit that says it's going on. And I know if I'm a Republican judge, for instance, it's considered not to be in your political interest, Democrats in the House, to say that that's the context you're working in. But if you're asking me to turn the materials over to you, I'm going to require that you state it explicitly, at which point I'll be forced, quote unquote forced, if I, care about precedent or the law or anything like that, I'll be forced to turn over the materials to you. But at least I will have extracted from you an admission that you are contemplating impeachment. Don't rule out, of course, the possibility that a Republican judge might pose that problem to Democrats. Democrats might then say, well, we'd be willing to release a letter that says, hey, I don't know where this is leading, but if the evidence is damning enough and the evidence takes us to impeachment, well, then maybe that's what's happening here. But it's not our plan to. We want it just as much for the possibility that it might rule out the necessity of impeachment. They might come up with some sort of hedging language like that, and that language might even work to a certain extent. Or, don't rule out with a Republican judge that Jerry Nadler finally has to answer and say, yes, the possibility is there. We might in fact, we'll say it outright. We want this material in the context of an impeachment proceeding. Yes, you got us. At which point a judge may still say, okay, I've extracted that from you, but I'm still not ordering the release. Now, that would, of course, be appealed and would, in ordinary circumstances, be overturned because, we have the precedent that says in an impeachment situation, you do have access to the grand jury materials. So, no, you can't just rule that you don't for arbitrary reasons because you're a Republican and you don't want the president to be in trouble. But we're not in ordinary times. And sure, why not? You could draw a panel of Republican circuit court judges who simply say, we also don't care. Well, that's outrageous too. We'll appeal that to the Supreme Court. Well, you might have a situation where 5 justices just say that other whole Nixon thing was a mistake anyway. The last couple Republican administrations have been filled to the brim with people who were trying to relitigate Watergate anyway. And although many of them became never Trumpers, they might enjoy the opportunity to relitigate Watergate and let the fingerprints on it be Trump's. And sorry, there no longer is a precedent for the release of grand jury materials to Congress unless the grand jury was investigating a Democrat, in which case we will come up with another excuse later to release that to a Republican House. But for the time being, no. If Democrats in the House want grand jury material on the bad acts of a Republican president, the answer is no. If the Republicans in the House would like information from a grand jury on the bad acts of a Democrat, we will later say yes. But they won't tell you right now. All right, so back to the article. There was we left off, they gave a vague reason to Barr, alluding to, yes, the issue of impeachment without saying as much. And from there, CRS legislative attorney Michael Foster wrote that a pair of court rulings, and CRS, once again, just to remind you since we took our diversion here, the Congressional Research Service, that wrote that there were exceptions wherein Congress could get grand jury material. One of their legislative attorneys wrote that a pair of court rulings had rejected a congressional committee's request for grand jury materials in its ordinary investigative and oversight role. The courts reasoned that those traditional committee functions, which would then, therefore, of course, include legislative context as well, were too remote from any judicial proceeding to trigger the judicial proceeding exception. By contrast, Foster continued, where a congressional committee has sought grand jury materials in connection with the contemplated impeachment of a specific public official, several courts have recognized that court-ordered disclosure may be available, and it's still just a may be available pursuant to the judicial proceeding exception. The key distinction is that an impeachment proceeding involves the prospect of a trial in the Senate to hear the charges against the public official and decide whether the individual ought to be removed from office. Several courts have recognized an impeachment trial as a quasi-judicial proceeding similar enough to a proceeding in court that it justifies the use of the judicial proceeding exception. Foster and his colleagues at the CRS did not respond to a request for an interview about his summary, and they never will. CRS doesn't do that. With or without the threat of impeachment, there is a possibility that Democrats could obtain disclosure if a court, recognizing that the fight over the Mueller materials is an extraordinary circumstance, exercises its authority over grand jury matters to make a disclosure. That is exactly what happened in 1974 when the grand jury materials from the Watergate Special Prosecutor's investigation were handed over to Congress. If grand jury materials from the special counsel's report or investigation are disclosed to Congress with a court's permission, the secrecy rules would not prevent the further disclosure of those materials by members. However, the court could seek to impose restrictions on any further release. In other words, would the public necessarily see it if Congress did? And the answer is not necessarily so. No. Whatever the court decides, it appears likely that Democrats in Congress will pursue the materials. Democrats should do all they can to get the grand jury material underpinning the Mueller report, said a Democratic staffer, speaking on the condition of anonymity because the source was not authorized to discuss the matter. But I don't think you really need to go that far afield to find people who believe that, yes, Democrats should do all they can to get the grand jury material. The grand jury materials will likely be critical to understanding the special counsel's conclusions and evidence behind them, the staffer said. Let's not pretend Republicans wouldn't do the same if the shoe were on the other foot. They've spent the past 2 years requesting every investigative document under the sun. And that is also true as well, of course. And everybody seems to know that. But let me just return for a second to the question of the obligation of the Senate here. It's interesting that's always interesting really by itself. But I guess, where was it that this occurred to me here? The court's reasoning that where a congressional committee has sought grand jury materials in connection with the contemplated impeachment of a specific public official, then several courts have recognized that court-ordered disclosure may be available pursuant to judicial proceedings exceptions, right? The key distinction, again, is that an impeachment proceeding involves the prospect of a trial in the Senate to hear the charges against the public official and decide whether that ought to be removed from office. So, here's a question. One, what is it in the Constitution that, if anything, that compels the Senate to conduct a trial? And the answer is on its face, and you know how these strict constructionists can be. On its face, the answer is nothing. It just says that the Senate will, has the sole authority to conduct the trial, but it doesn't say that within 15 days of being handed the impeachment or anything like that, put any time limits on it, just that the House has the sole authority to impeach and the Senate has the sole authority to try. And, think about Mitch McConnell's record. It doesn't say anywhere that they have to consider or vote on people whom the president nominates to the Supreme Court, and so they just didn't, and so therefore Merrick Garland isn't on the Supreme Court, or never got his vote anyway. Who knows what the result might have been. And we've just decided that we are stuck with that and have to live with it for whatever reason, although, we don't, but for the most part people have decided that anyhow. And similarly, there isn't anything anywhere that says, yeah, you absolutely have to have a trial. It's just sort of been assumed. Well, of course you would have a trial. The House of Representatives has impeached the President of the United States. What could you possibly do other? You can't just simply exist under a cloud and let the President continue to serve in office under this cloud the whole time, can you? Well, what if you can? Or what if you decide to? And what if you decide not only that, but you decide to say that also there's no cloud? I mean, that's a PR game and nothing more. But politically speaking, legally speaking, is there any reason to believe that McConnell wouldn't or couldn't just say, well, the Constitution is pretty clear on one thing. The sole power to try the impeachment falls to the Senate. And by extension, we would also, of course, have the sole power to decide not to try the case. And sole power is the clearest thing in here. There would be no other authority which the Senate would be willing to recognize as having the right to compel us to conduct this trial. We have the sole power to conduct it. And we opt not to conduct it. And no one else can in the absence of our decision to do so. And also, therefore, no one can compel us to do so. I don't know that that's a rock solid conclusion, but you want to see an interesting battle that will take us right through to the end of the current Congress and into the 2020 elections without coming to any conclusion, that one will do it. But I don't think we'll ever get there because we'll be battling the subpoenas all the way to the 2020 election, or at least close enough to the 2020 election that those who are afraid of the I word will insist that we set this aside and let the ballot box settle this whole thing, which, that's kind of a crapshoot. And not entirely certain that that's the way we want that to be settled, given how easy it has been, let's say, for malevolent forces to shape the outcome of those elections for a long time, not just necessarily in the 2016 elections. But that's an open question. Suppose they don't, or they simply state their unwillingness to hold a trial. While they hold a majority and the ability to use the power of the gavel to pretty much validate whatever decision they might want to make, they might also likewise argue to courts considering the question of the release of grand jury material, because the key distinction, according to Michael Foster, CRS legislative attorney, and he may not be the last word on this, but at least one authoritative source has argued that the key distinction that would allow for the release of grand jury material to Congress in an impeachment proceeding is that it involves the prospect of a trial in the Senate. I am here to tell you, as Majority Leader of the United States Senate, that there is no prospect of a trial in the Senate for this impeachment. This Senate will not be holding any impeachment trial regardless. Does not matter to us in the least what information might be referred to us by the House in articles of impeachment. It is their prerogative to pass them, and it is our prerogative to lay them upon the table and let them stay there. There is no prospect of a trial. Without the prospect of a trial, there is no judicial proceeding happening here. Of course, the courts could still say, well, grand jury is a judicial proceeding nonetheless, and we have authority over that. And the analogy to the grand jury portion of the process is still unchallenged and unchanged and is sufficient to uphold the theorized exception to the grand jury secrecy rules. So although you might decline to hold a trial, and there isn't anything that we can do about that, there likewise is nothing that you can do about the House of Representatives and how it acts analogous to a grand jury. So it might not be enough to prevent the release of the grand jury material, or, depending on judges who sit on this case, they may say, yeah, I do find that a key distinction is the prospect of a trial in the Senate. And if there isn't one, then it's all a waste of time. So we will see. It could be very interesting, to say the very least. There's an awful lot. There's an awful lot of moving parts to this. And that reminds me very much of a New York Times piece that I don't think we read in its entirety when it came out back in September of last year. Charlie Savage, writing for the New York Times, legal experts urge release of Watergate report to offer Mueller a roadmap. Do you remember this story? This was the story of, let's see if we can get through the context of it up at the top. I don't remember whether we read it online or alluded to it. A question has loomed over Washington. What will the special counsel, Robert Mueller, do when he wraps up his investigation into whether the Trump campaign conspired with Russia and whether President Trump obstructed justice? Well, we know now what the answer is. He issues a report. The leading theory, let's see how it stands up, is that Mr. Mueller will write a report, so far so good, for his supervisor at the Justice Department. That could lead to a new fight. Mr. Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, remember him, has suggested that the White House may then invoke executive privilege and order that the Justice Department keep portions of such a report confidential from Congress. Well, they are looking to try to keep such a report or parts of it confidential from Congress, but so far the claim hasn't been executive privilege. And there are articles out there now arguing that executive privilege has likewise been waived by sharing some of the information with Mueller. And we'll see how those things stand up. But so far they haven't made the executive privilege claim. But there is historical precedent, there it is again, for another model. Echoing a move by the Watergate prosecutor in March of 1974, the grand jury with which Mr. Mueller has been working could try to send a report about the evidence it has gathered directly to the House Judiciary Committee. That's not the analogy we're working with so far, but it's one worth keeping in mind. On Friday, and this was begun back in September of last year, seeking to draw more attention to that option, 3 prominent legal analysts asked a court to lift a veil of secrecy that has long kept that Watergate-era report hidden. Specifically, the petition asks a judge to unseal a report that Leon Jaworski, the Watergate prosecutor, used to send Congress the evidence he had gathered about President Nixon's misconduct. Known as the Roadmap, it was a 55-page index describing evidence and citing underlying testimony and tapes, but without any legal analysis or recommendations, sound familiar, about whether Mr. Nixon committed an impeachable offense. While the Judiciary Committee had access to the Roadmap, it has remained sealed from public view. This petition presents an extraordinarily compelling interest in the disclosure arrayed against a vanishingly small countervailing interest, the court filing said, noting that the Watergate players are mostly dead and that much of the evidence is already public. It added, not only does the roadmap carry immense historical significance in understanding the Watergate investigation, it provides a key precedent for assessing the appropriate framework for Special Counsel Mueller to report to Congress any findings of potentially unlawful conduct by President Trump. The petition was filed by Benjamin Wittes, a Brookings Institution senior fellow and the editor-in-chief of Lawfare, an online publication that specializes in national security legal policy issues, Jack Goldsmith, Harvard Law School professor and senior Justice Department official in the George W. Bush administration, and Stephen Bates, a University of Nevada, Las Vegas law professor who, as a federal prosecutor working for Ken Starr, the independent counsel who invested President Clinton, co-wrote the report to Congress recommending that Mr. Clinton be impeached. The 3 are represented by Protect Democracy, a government watchdog group. It is uncertain how a roadmap-style grand jury report would play out in the Trump-Russia case. Justice Department rules permit Mr. Mueller's supervisor to veto any unwarranted investigative or prosecutorial step, but it's not clear whether asking a grand jury to send a report to Congress qualifies as such. Remember that we read in the beginning of the previous piece about the extraordinary powers of the grand jury. The grand jury, in other words, could, on its own, or be prompted to simply say, we'll send the grand jury material to Congress. That's what we want to do with it. Anyway, Mueller's supervisor, currently Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, back in September anyway, but that could change if Mr. Trump fires him or Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, who was recused from the Russia investigation, leaving Rosenstein as acting AG, but instead we have William Barr, to whom this has fallen. The option of a grand jury report could also have implications if Mr. Trump were to force the Justice Department to shut down Mueller's investigation. It's not clear what would happen if the grand jury members on their own initiative were to ask the judge presiding over their panel to transmit I've lost my place here. To transmit to Congress all the evidence they had gathered without the executive branch's request or approval. Unlike Mr. Jaworski in 1974 and Mueller today, Starr was operating under a law enacted after Watergate and since lapsed, the independent counsel law, that clearly gave him the authority to send a report directly to Congress. And there is much more to this analysis. You should, of course, read it if you didn't read it the first time around. But very fascinating possibility that exists there. And, of course, there is mention even in the famed Jefferson's Manual of impeachment proceedings having been initiated in the House, or impeachment debate anyway, initiated in the House on the report of information from a grand jury. There is precedent for that direct pipeline, never with a presidential impeachment so far, but there you have it. So a lot of moving parts here that could lead up to a very interesting conclusion sometime in the, let's say, probably distant future. But at least the ball's rolling. We have that much to report. The West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy has much more to report and comes up next. Justice will take you into many other areas of news and esoterica following, well, this break. And
From
then
Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com.
a few minutes more.
You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show.
With David Waldman.
Well, here's the kind of stuff. We've got a federal judge struck down a girls-only school dress code as unconstitutional. Trump officials are now jailing parents who just want to get their kids back. And Mussolini's granddaughter defended Trump in a fight with actor Jim Carrey over a Twitter post about fascism. Doesn't get more online than that.